Carter Weston was a name synonymous with power and arrogance in the legal world. A polished, well-dressed man in his late 40s, he had built his career on a ruthless reputation for winning cases by any means necessary. Clients sought him not for his charm or integrity, but for his aggressive tactics and his uncanny ability to find loopholes in any argument. To Carter, courtrooms were battlefields, and he thrived on making his opponents squirm under pressure. His success had bred a sense of entitlement that now radiated in every word he spoke, every glance he cast, and every step he took. It was evident in the way he carried his sleek leather briefcase as though it contained the secrets to the universe, and in the way his cold, calculating blue eyes scanned a room, assessing the weaknesses of everyone in it. Today, Carter strode confidently into the courtroom, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished marble floor. This wasn't just any case. He was representing a major corporate client accused of fraudulent practices that had displaced dozens of families from their homes. To Carter, it was just another opportunity to flex his skills. The stakes were high, but so were the potential rewards. His client, a wealthy real estate developer, had promised him not only a generous fee, but also a pathway to even more influential clients in the future. Carter had no interest in the moral implications of the case. He rarely did. To him, the families involved were nothing more than an obstacle to be crushed, another notch in his belt of victories. As he entered the courtroom, he barely spared a glance at the opposing counsel or the scattered individuals in the gallery. Instead, his attention was drawn to a modestly dressed black woman sitting quietly at the side of the room. Her demeanor was calm, almost serene, and she seemed to be observing the proceedings without drawing attention to herself. To Carter, she looked like she might be an assistant or perhaps even a court clerk. She certainly didn't fit the image of anyone important, let alone someone he needed to acknowledge. Dismissing her as irrelevant, he turned his attention back to the task at hand. "Hey, you," Carter called out sharply, his voice cutting through the soft murmur of the room. Heads turned as he gestured impatiently toward the woman. "I need some water, and bring me the case materials while you're at it." The woman didn't react immediately. She simply looked at him with a calm, measured gaze that seemed to unsettle him for a split second before he brushed it off. When she didn't move, Carter clicked his tongue in annoyance. "Let's not waste time here," he added, his tone laced with condescension. "I have a case to win." Before the situation could escalate further, the sound of a gavel striking wood silenced the room. A court officer entered and cleared his throat. "All rise for Chief Judge Vivian Grant," he announced with authority. Carter froze. The name barely registered at first, but when the modestly dressed woman stood and walked toward the bench with steady confidence, his face shifted from mild confusion to complete shock. She wasn't an assistant. She wasn't a clerk. She was the judge presiding over the case. The realization hit him like a slap, but he quickly masked his surprise, straightening his tie and adopting an air of indifference, as though he hadn't just humiliated himself in front of the entire room. Vivian Grant moved with grace as she took her place behind the bench. Her every motion was deliberate, her posture commanding respect without needing to demand it. She adjusted her robe and surveyed the courtroom with sharp, discerning eyes. There was no trace of anger or indignation over Carter's earlier behavior, only an aura of calm authority that immediately silenced any lingering whispers in the room. She tapped her gavel once more and spoke, her voice clear and steady. "Good morning. This court is now in session," she began, her gaze sweeping over the room before settling briefly on Carter. There was no malice in her expression, only a quiet confidence that made his earlier arrogance seem small and insignificant. "We are here to hear arguments in the case of the People versus Western Real Estate Holdings." Carter swallowed hard but quickly regained his composure. He was used to controlling the narrative, and he wasn't about to let this unexpected turn of events throw him off his game. Straightening his shoulders, he leaned over to his junior associate and muttered, "She's just another judge. Don't let her get to you." But something about Judge Grant unnerved him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just her presence or the way she seemed to effortlessly command the room, it was the way she looked at him, as though she could see straight through his carefully constructed facade. For the first time in a long time, Carter felt a flicker of doubt, though he quickly pushed it aside. He had faced tougher judges before, or so he told himself. Vivian didn't acknowledge his earlier outburst, nor did she let it affect her demeanor. Instead, she turned her attention to the counsel for the opposing side, a young, earnest attorney representing the families who had lost their homes. Her tone was professional but warm as she addressed him, setting the tone for what she expected from the proceedings. Carter watched, his irritation growing. He wasn't used to being overshadowed, especially not by someone he had so blatantly underestimated. As the opening arguments began, Carter took his usual approach: dominate the room, overwhelm the opposition with jargon, and subtly undermine anyone who dared to challenge him. But each time he tried to steer the conversation or distract from the key points, Judge Grant was there, cutting through his arguments with incisive questions and sharp observations. Her legal acumen was undeniable, and Carter quickly realized that she wasn't someone he could easily manipulate. By the end of the first session, Carter was visibly irritated, though he hid it behind his usual smug facade. As the courtroom emptied for a recess, he lingered behind, watching as Judge Grant gathered her papers. For a moment, he considered apologizing for his earlier behavior, but his pride wouldn't allow it. Instead, he muttered under his breath, "This is going to be a long case." Judge Grant didn't look up, but a faint smile tugged at the corners of her mouth as she walked past him. Carter couldn't tell if it was meant to be a silent rebuke or simply a show of quiet confidence. Either way, it left him unsettled. As he left the courtroom, his mind raced with strategies, each one more aggressive than the last. He had no intention of letting anyone, least of all a judge who had already gotten under his skin, stand in the way of his victory. But deep down, a small voice whispered that this time, things might not go as planned. As the courtroom reconvened after the brief recess, Carter Weston walked back to his table with his characteristic swagger, masking the unease that had started to creep into his mind. His client, a portly real estate magnate named Theodore Banks, leaned over to whisper something to him. Carter responded with a curt nod, his attention clearly focused on the judge's bench. Judge Vivian Grant had returned to her seat, calm and composed as ever, sorting through her papers with the efficiency of someone who had seen countless cases in her career. There was no indication that she had been affected by Carter's earlier behavior, but her steady, measured demeanor only irritated him further. He thrived on shaking his opponents, and this woman was proving immune to his usual tactics. "All right, gentlemen," Judge Grant said, tapping her gavel lightly to bring the room to order. Her voice was firm but not overbearing. "Let's resume where we left off. Mr. Weston, you may proceed with your argument." Carter stood, straightened his tie, and stepped forward. He had spent the recess refining his strategy, determined to regain control of the room and, most importantly, the narrative. He knew that the key to this case was to drown the opposition in complexity, bury them under legal jargon and convoluted arguments until their claims seemed insignificant. It was a tried and true method that had worked for him countless times before. "Your Honor," Carter began, his tone smooth and polished, "it's clear that this case, while emotionally charged, is built on shaky legal ground. The plaintiffs have failed to provide any substantial evidence to support their claims of fraud against my client. The documents in question, as we will demonstrate, were fully compliant with state regulations at the time of execution. Any perceived discrepancies are nothing more than misunderstandings or clerical errors, which, while regrettable, do not amount to criminal intent. He paused for effect, allowing his words to hang in the air. The young opposing attorney, Nathan Reed, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Carter smirked inwardly. He had seen this reaction before, the nervous energy of a less experienced lawyer who was out of his depth. This was going to be easier than he thought. But just as Carter was about to continue, Judge Grant interjected. "Mr. Weston, while your point about state regulations is noted, I must ask, are you suggesting that the plaintiff's claims are entirely without merit? Because from the evidence submitted so far, there appears to be a pattern of irregularities in the documents provided by your client." Her question was direct, cutting through Carter's carefully crafted argument like a knife. He blinked, momentarily caught off guard, before quickly recovering. "Your Honor, I believe the so-called irregularities are being grossly exaggerated. The plaintiffs are attempting to create a narrative of wrongdoing where none exists." "Interesting," Judge Grant replied, her expression neutral. "Then perhaps you could explain why several of the notarized signatures on these documents appear to belong to individuals who were not in the state at the time of signing, or why certain contracts contain clauses that were retroactively altered after execution." The courtroom fell silent. Carter felt a bead of sweat forming at the base of his neck. This was not the direction he had expected the conversation to take. He glanced at his client, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. Theodore Banks looked like he was about to explode, and Carter knew that if he didn't take control of the situation quickly, the case could spiral out of his grasp. "Your Honor." "Ifris," Carter said, his voice tightening slightly, "I would like to remind the court that these allegations have yet to be substantiated. My client has operated within the bounds of the law at all times, and any discrepancies are the result of miscommunications between various parties involved in the transactions." Judge Grant tilted her head slightly, her sharp eyes locking onto Carter's. "Miscommunications, Mr. Weston? That's an interesting choice of words. Are you suggesting that the responsibility for these discrepancies lies elsewhere?" Carter's jaw clenched. He could feel the room turning against him. Judge Grant's line of questioning was deliberate, calculated to poke holes in his defense. He had to tread carefully. "I'm simply pointing out, Your Honor, that my client cannot be held accountable for the actions of third parties over whom he has no control." "And yet," Judge Grant said, her voice calm but unyielding, "these third parties appear to be employees of your client's company. Am I mistaken?" Carter felt the ground shift beneath him. She was good better than he had anticipated. "Your Honor," he said, forcing a smile, "with all due respect, I believe these questions are more appropriate for the evidentiary stage of the trial. At this point, I would like to focus on the legal framework surrounding the plaintiff's claims." Judge Grant leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. "Of course, Mr. Weston. Please proceed." Carter returned to his table, his confidence shaken but not broken. He could recover from this. He had faced difficult judges before and still come out on top. He just needed to regroup and shift the narrative back in his favor. Turning to his client, he whispered, "Don't worry. She's just posturing. Let me handle this." But as the session continued, it became increasingly clear that Judge Grant was not the kind of judge Carter was used to dealing with. She was meticulous, challenging every point he made with precision and clarity. She didn't raise her voice or show any outward signs of frustration, but her presence was undeniably commanding. Each time Carter tried to sidestep a question or deflect blame, she brought him back to the core issues of the case, forcing him to address the facts head-on. The opposing attorney, Nathan Reed, began to gain confidence, buoyed by Judge Grant's support. He presented his arguments with growing conviction, citing specific instances of fraud and misconduct that painted a damning picture of Carter's client. Carter watched with mounting irritation as the young lawyer gained momentum, his earlier nervousness replaced by a steady determination. By the time the session ended for the day, Carter was seething. He had managed to keep his composure in the courtroom, but as soon as he stepped into the hallway, his frustration boiled over. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to his associate, a young woman named Lisa, who had been silently taking notes throughout the proceedings. "She's clearly biased. No judge should be this involved in questioning. It's not her job to act like opposing counsel." Lisa hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. "She's thorough," she said carefully. "And she seems to know this case inside and out." Carter shot her a sharp look. "Are you saying I'm not prepared?" "Of course not," Lisa said quickly. "I'm just saying. We might need to adjust our approach," Carter scoffed. "Our approach is fine. She's the one overstepping. I'll deal with it tomorrow." But deep down, Carter knew that he was facing an uphill battle. Judge Grant wasn't like the other judges he had encountered in his career. She wasn't intimidated by his reputation or swayed by his theatrics. She was a formidable opponent in her own right, and she wasn't going to make this easy for him. As he left the courthouse that evening, Carter's mind raced with strategies and contingencies. He would find a way to regain control of the case he always did. But for the first time in years, a seed of doubt had taken root in his mind. Judge Grant was unlike anyone he had ever faced, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this time he might be out of his depth. The morning after the tense courtroom session, Carter Weston arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual, his mood sour and his nerves tightly wound. His usual confidence was still present, but it felt more like a mask now, barely covering the lingering frustration from his encounter with Judge Vivian Grant the day before. He had spent much of the night poring over documents, searching for any detail he could use to regain control of the case. Despite his best efforts, he hadn't found anything groundbreaking. The judge's relentless questions and her ability to see through his usual tactics had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. As he stepped into the courtroom, he noticed Judge Grant already seated at the bench, flipping through the case file with the same calm efficiency that had irritated him the day before. She looked completely unbothered, as though she had already prepared for every possible move he might make. Her confidence only stoked his irritation. Carter had no intention of letting her dominate the proceedings again. Today he would fight back, harder and smarter. The courtroom began to fill with people. Plaintiffs took their seats, some with visible anxiety etched on their faces, others glaring at Carter and his client, Theodore Banks, with barely concealed contempt. Carter ignored them, focusing on his strategy. Nathan Reed, the opposing attorney, arrived soon after, his demeanor more composed than the previous day. Carter noted the change and sneered inwardly. Reed might have gained some confidence, but he was still green compared to a seasoned litigator like Carter. When the session began, Judge Grant opened with a direct statement that immediately set the tone for the day. "Before we proceed, I would like to address a matter that came up yesterday. Mr. Weston, your argument suggested that any discrepancies in the documents submitted by your client were the result of miscommunications and errors by third parties. I've reviewed the evidence presented thus far, and there are several points that require clarification. We will address these before moving forward." Carter stiffened. This wasn't how he had envisioned starting the day. "Your Honor," he began, forcing a polite tone, "with all due respect, I believe these matters are better suited for the evidentiary stage." Judge Grant's eyes met his, unflinching. and yet they pertain directly to the credibility of the documents you've submitted. Credibility is not a matter to be deferred, Mr. Weston. It's the foundation of this case. Carter clenched his jaw but managed a tight smile. Of course, Your Honor. The judge gestured for the opposing counsel to proceed. Nathan Reed stood, his hands steady as he began presenting a series of discrepancies in the contracts provided by Carter's client. One by one, he outlined how dates, signatures, and clauses had been altered in ways that clearly pointed to deliberate fraud. His delivery was calm but methodical, and Carter could see how the jury, though not yet impaneled, was beginning to turn against them. Carter rose to cross-examine the points Reed had made, determined to dismantle them. Mr. Reed, he said, his voice dripping with condescension, you've painted quite a dramatic picture here. But isn't it possible that these so-called discrepancies were merely administrative oversights? After all, errors in documentation are not uncommon in large-scale real estate transactions. Reed didn't falter. Possible, yes, but unlikely given the pattern of these errors. Each alteration benefits your client while disadvantaging the plaintiffs. That doesn't look like an oversight, it looks like intent. The courtroom murmured, and Carter felt the pressure mounting. He decided to change tactics. Your Honor, he said, turning to Judge Grant, I would like to request additional time to review these claims and prepare a response. It seems the opposing counsel has unearthed new information that was not previously disclosed. Judge Grant raised an eyebrow. Mr. Weston, all evidence presented today was included in the discovery phase. You've had ample time to review it. Request denied. Proceed. The denial stung, and Carter could feel his temper fraying. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure, but his frustration seeped into his voice as he continued to question Reed. Isn't it true, Mr. Reed, that your clients were offered compensation for their properties at market value? In fact, some of them were offered above market rates. How, then, can you claim they were defrauded? Reed nodded, prepared for this line of attack. Compensation was offered, yes, but only after my clients had already been misled into signing contracts that stripped them of legal protections. They were coerced into accepting terms they didn't fully understand because of the deceptive practices employed by your client. Carter scoffed, letting his disdain show. Coerced? That's quite a strong word, isn't it? Were they held at gunpoint, threatened in any way? Nathan remained calm. Coercion doesn't have to involve physical threats, Mr. Weston. Manipulating someone's understanding of a contract through deceitful practices is a form of coercion, and the evidence shows that's exactly what happened here. Carter opened his mouth to retort, but Judge Grant intervened. Mr. Weston, unless you have new evidence to present, I suggest we move on. Her tone was firm, and Carter knew better than to push back, though his anger simmered beneath the surface. He returned to his seat, his mind racing with ways to regain control. This wasn't going as planned, and the longer it went on, the more apparent it became that Judge Grant was steering the proceedings in a way that left him little room to maneuver. As the session continued, Judge Grant began to scrutinize the documents submitted by Carter's client. She pointed out inconsistencies and asked pointed questions that Theodore Banks struggled to answer. At one point, Banks, clearly frustrated, muttered something under his breath that was just loud enough for the courtroom to hear. Your Honor, this is ridiculous, Banks snapped. These people just want a payout. They don't care about the truth. The room fell silent. Judge Grant's expression didn't change, but her gaze hardened as she looked at Banks. Mr. Banks, I will remind you that this is a court of law. You will conduct yourself with respect, or I will hold you in contempt. Banks glared at her but said nothing further. Carter shot him a warning look, silently willing him to keep his temper in check. The last thing they needed was for the client to make things worse. During the lunch recess, Carter retreated to a quiet corner of the courthouse with his associate Lisa. His frustration was palpable, and Lisa hesitated before speaking. "Do you think we should consider negotiating a settlement?" she asked cautiously. Carter whirled on her, his voice low and sharp. "Absolutely not. We're not settling. This case is winnable." "Is it?" Lisa asked, her tone careful but firm. "Judge Grant seems determined to get to the truth, and Reed's arguments are stronger than we expected. If this continues, we could be looking at a significant loss." Carter glared at her, but her words hit a nerve. He knew she was right, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. "We're not losing," he said through gritted teeth. "I just need to rethink our strategy." When the session resumed, Carter doubled down on his aggression. He interrupted Reed's arguments, objected at every opportunity, and tried to dominate the proceedings with his usual theatrics. But Judge Grant was unyielding. She overruled his objections with a calm efficiency that only fueled his anger. At one point, she stopped him mid-sentence. "Mr. Weston," she said, her tone sharp, "this court will not tolerate disruptive behavior. If you cannot conduct yourself professionally, I will have no choice but to impose sanctions." The warning hung in the air, and Carter forced himself to back down, though his anger was now barely contained. He could feel the courtroom slipping further out of his control, and for the first time, he began to wonder if this case might end in a humiliating defeat. As the day drew to a close, Carter found himself staring at Judge Grant, who remained as composed and unflappable as ever. She was a formidable adversary, and he hated the thought of admitting that she might be more than a match for him. But the evidence was piling up against his client, and his usual tactics were failing. The session ended with Judge Grant announcing that the court would reconvene the following morning. Carter barely heard her words as he gathered his papers and left the courtroom, his mind racing with frustration and desperation. He needed a new plan, and fast. Because if he couldn't turn the tide, this case might be the one that finally brought him to his knees. The morning of the third day in court began with a palpable tension hanging over the room. Carter Weston sat at his table, reviewing his notes with an intensity that betrayed his usual air of unflappable confidence. His client, Theodore Banks, was seated beside him, fidgeting with his tie and muttering under his breath about the bias he was certain Judge Grant was showing. Carter barely acknowledged him, focused instead on formulating a plan to regain control of the proceedings. Today would be different, he told himself. He wasn't going to let anyone, not Nathan Reed, not Judge Vivian Grant, get the better of him again. The courtroom filled quickly as people filed into their seats, the buzz of quiet murmurs building as everyone speculated about how the day would unfold. The plaintiffs had been gaining momentum, and the previous day's session had left Carter scrambling to contain the damage. Judge Grant's precise questioning and Reed's growing confidence had turned the tide of the case, and Carter knew the jury, though still observing from the gallery, was beginning to lean toward sympathy for the displaced families. If Carter didn't act decisively, it wouldn't just be a loss for his client, it would be a devastating blow to his reputation. As Judge Grant entered and took her seat at the bench, the room fell silent. She wasted no time in getting started. "Mr. Reed," she said, her tone calm but firm, "I understand you have additional evidence to present regarding the contracts in question." "Yes, Your Honor," Reed replied, standing with a stack of documents in hand. He walked confidently to the front of the room, his movements no longer hesitant or unsure. He had found his rhythm, and Carter felt a stab of annoyance watching the young attorney come into his own. Reed began laying out his evidence: copies of emails, internal memos, and financial records that painted a damning picture of Carter's client. The documents revealed a deliberate scheme to exploit loopholes in the law and mislead the plaintiffs into signing away their rights. Reed's voice was steady as he walked the court through each piece of evidence, connecting the dots with the ease of someone who had prepared meticulously. Carter sat rigidly at his table, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to let this go unchallenged. When Reed finished his presentation, Carter rose slowly, his movements deliberate as he approached the front of the courtroom. "Your Honor," he began, his tone measured but sharp, "while my esteemed colleague has certainly woven an engaging narrative, I must point out that the evidence he's presented is circumstantial at best. These documents do not prove intent on the part of my client." Judge Grant raised an eyebrow. "Circumstantial, Mr. Weston? I would think that an internal memo explicitly instructing employees to alter contract terms would be more than circumstantial." Carter's jaw tightened. He had read the memo in question the night before, and he knew it was damaging. But he wasn't about to let it derail him. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "context is everything. That memo, while poorly worded, was not intended to deceive. It was part of a routine review process to ensure compliance with evolving regulations." Judge Grant didn't react immediately, her sharp gaze fixed on him. The silence stretched for a moment before she said, "And yet, Mr. Weston, the alterations made to these contracts all seem to benefit your client, while disadvantaging the plaintiffs. How do you explain that?" Carter opened his mouth to respond, but before he could formulate a coherent answer, his client, Theodore Banks, suddenly blurted out, "This is a witch hunt. They're twisting everything to make me look bad." The outburst sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom. Carter's eyes widened in alarm as he turned to his client, hissing under his breath, "Sit down and be quiet." But the damage was already done. Judge Grant fixed Banks with a cold, steely gaze. "Mr. Banks, I will remind you once again that this is a court of law. Disruptions and inappropriate comments will not be tolerated. If you cannot control yourself, I will have you removed from the courtroom." Banks muttered something under his breath but didn't speak further. Carter took a deep breath, trying to salvage the situation. "Your Honor, I apologize on behalf of my client. Emotions are understandably high, given the gravity of this case." Judge Grant's expression didn't soften. "Mr. Weston, I suggest you advise your client to conduct himself appropriately. This court will not tolerate further interruptions." Carter nodded tightly and returned to his table, silently cursing Banks for his lack of discipline. He could feel the jury's eyes on them, their judgment palpable even without a word being spoken. This wasn't just about winning the case anymore, it was about maintaining control, and he was dangerously close to losing it. As the session continued, Judge Grant began to press Carter on specific details of the contracts. Her questions were precise, her tone calm but unyielding. "Mr. Weston," she said at one point, "these contracts contain clauses that were clearly added after the plaintiffs had already signed. Are you suggesting they agreed to these terms retroactively?" Carter knew he was walking a tightrope. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "the modifications were made as part of standard post-signature revisions, which are common in complex real estate transactions." Standard revisions. Judge Grant's voice was sharp now, her eyes narrowing. "Revisions that strip tenants of their rights and grant your client unilateral control over their properties. That doesn't strike me as standard practice." Carter felt his palms begin to sweat. He knew he couldn't afford to stumble here, but the weight of her questioning was relentless. "Your Honor," he said, his voice tightening, "while I understand how this may appear, I assure you there was no intent to deceive. My client acted in good faith." Judge Grant leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Good faith, Mr. Weston, is not a defense against fraud." If these terms were added without the plaintiff's knowledge, then intent becomes irrelevant. The contracts are invalid. The declaration sent a shockwave through the room. Carter's stomach dropped as he realized the implications. If the contracts were deemed invalid, his entire defense would collapse. He needed a new strategy, and he needed it fast. As the day wore on, Carter's frustration grew. Reed continued to present his case with growing confidence, bolstered by Judge Grant's support. The plaintiffs, many of whom had been quiet and reserved up until now, began to speak up, their voices steady as they recounted how they had been misled and exploited. Their stories were raw and emotional, and Carter could feel the jury's sympathy shifting entirely to their side. By the time the session ended, Carter was seething. He had spent the entire day on the defensive, unable to regain control of the narrative. Judge Grant had seen through every one of his tactics, and Reed had capitalized on every misstep. As he gathered his papers and prepared to leave the courtroom, he felt a surge of anger and resentment toward everyone in the room: Reed, the plaintiffs, Judge Grant, even his own client. But as he walked out of the courthouse, a new emotion began to creep in: fear. For the first time in his career, Carter Weston felt the weight of impending defeat. Judge Grant wasn't just a formidable opponent, she was an immovable force, and she was determined to see justice served. Carter knew that if he didn't find a way to turn the tide, his reputation, his career, and his carefully constructed image of invincibility would all come crashing down. The fourth day of the trial began with a heavy, almost oppressive tension in the courtroom. Carter Weston arrived earlier than usual, hoping to establish some sense of control before the session began. His client, Theodore Banks, trailed behind him, visibly agitated and muttering complaints about how the judge was out to get him. Carter barely acknowledged the ranting, his mind racing with potential strategies. The previous day had been a disaster. Judge Vivian Grant's unrelenting questions and Nathan Reed's growing momentum had put him firmly on the back foot. His usual tactics weren't working, and for the first time in his career, he felt the looming shadow of defeat creeping closer. As the courtroom filled with spectators, plaintiffs, and legal teams, Carter sat at his table, flipping through documents with an almost frantic energy. His associate, Lisa, approached cautiously, holding a folder. "I went through everything again last night," she said quietly. "There's nothing we haven't already used. If they keep pushing about the altered contracts..." "Stop," Carter cut her off, his voice low but sharp. "We're not conceding anything. I'll handle it." Lisa hesitated, then nodded and stepped back. Carter knew she was right, but admitting that wasn't an option. Not here. Not now. He had to think of something, anything, to shift the momentum back in his favor. The session began promptly as Judge Grant entered the courtroom, her presence as commanding as ever. She took her seat at the bench and scanned the room with her sharp, discerning eyes. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady. "Before we proceed, I want to address a matter that arose during yesterday's session." Carter felt his chest tighten. He knew what was coming. "Mr. Weston," Judge Grant continued, turning her gaze directly to him, "your client's outburst yesterday was highly inappropriate. This court will not tolerate such behavior. If there are any further disruptions, I will have no choice but to hold Mr. Banks in contempt." Carter forced a tight smile. "Understood, Your Honor. I've spoken to my client, and there won't be any further issues." Judge Grant didn't appear convinced but nodded briskly. "Very well. Let's continue." Nathan Reed was the first to speak, presenting a new set of documents that added yet another layer to the case. These were internal communications between Banks and his senior staff, detailing how they had deliberately targeted vulnerable tenants and pushed them into signing predatory contracts. The emails were damning, filled with language that left little room for interpretation. Carter rose to his feet, attempting to intercept the damage before it could fully take root. "Your Honor," he began, his voice firm but strained, "these documents are being taken out of context. While they may appear incriminating at first glance, they are part of broader discussions about the company's strategic direction. They do not prove intent to defraud." Judge Grant raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Weston, these emails explicitly discuss methods to pressure tenants into agreements that would strip them of their rights. Please explain how this could be considered strategic direction rather than intent." Carter clenched his jaw, searching for a way to spin the narrative. "Your Honor, corporate communications often include aggressive language as part of internal brainstorming. These emails do not reflect the actual actions taken by my client." Judge Grant leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression unreadable. "So you're suggesting that these were hypothetical discussions that never translated into action?" "That is correct, Your Honor," Carter said, seizing the opportunity. Nathan Reed, however, was prepared. "Your Honor, we have direct testimony from former employees of Mr. Banks' company who can confirm that these discussions were, in fact, implemented. I would like to call one of these witnesses to the stand." The room fell silent. Carter's stomach dropped. He hadn't anticipated this. He glanced at Banks, whose face had gone pale. The man leaned toward him, hissing under his breath, "You said they wouldn't have anything solid." Carter ignored him, focusing instead on Judge Grant, who was already nodding. "Mr. Reed, you may call your witness." The witness was a former project manager at Banks' company, a middle-aged man named Alan Draper. Draper looked nervous as he took the stand, but his resolve was clear. Under Reed's questioning, he described in painstaking detail how the company had systematically altered contracts, targeted low-income tenants, and used legal loopholes to strip them of their homes. His testimony was damning, painting a picture of a calculated and predatory operation. Carter knew he had to discredit Draper if he wanted to salvage the case. When it was his turn to cross-examine, he approached the witness with a practiced air of confidence. "Mr. Draper," he began, his tone sharp, "you claim to have been involved in these alleged practices. Is that correct?" "Yes," Draper said, his voice steady. "And yet, you worked for Mr. Banks' company for over a decade. If these practices were so egregious, why did you remain employed there for so long?" Draper hesitated, and Carter pressed on. "Were you complicit in these actions? Did you benefit financially from them?" "No," Draper said quickly. "I stayed because I needed the job. I didn't agree with what was happening, but I didn't have a choice." Carter pounced. "So you're admitting that you willingly participated in practices you now claim were unethical? How can this court trust your testimony when you've already demonstrated a willingness to compromise your morals for a paycheck?" Draper's face flushed, but before he could respond, Judge Grant interjected. "Mr. Weston, your point is noted, but I would remind you that this court is interested in the facts of the case, not the moral character of the witness. Please focus your questions accordingly." Carter gritted his teeth but nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." Despite his efforts, Draper's testimony left a significant mark on the case. The plaintiff's narrative was growing stronger by the minute, and Carter could feel the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. His usual confidence was beginning to crack, and even Lisa, who had always been a quiet but supportive presence, looked concerned. As the day progressed, the tension in the room reached a boiling point. Carter's frustration was evident in his increasingly aggressive objections and his barely veiled disdain for Reed's arguments. Judge Grant, however, remained composed, her calm demeanor only adding to Carter's sense of helplessness. The breaking point came when Reed introduced a final piece of evidence, a recorded phone call between Banks and one of his senior executives. In the recording, Banks could be heard instructing the executive to find a way to shut these people up and make sure they don't have a leg to stand on in court. The recording was devastating. The room fell silent as it played, the weight of Banks' words hanging heavily in the air. Carter felt his heart sink. There was no spinning this. No amount of legal maneuvering could erase the impact of that recording. When the recording ended, Judge Grant turned to Carter. Her expression was as calm as ever, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that sent a chill down his spine. "Mr. Weston," she said, her voice steady, "do you wish to respond to this evidence?" Carter hesitated, his mind racing. He knew there was nothing he could say that would undo the damage, but admitting defeat wasn't an option. He stood slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Your Honor," he began, his voice measured, "this recording, while troubling, does not change the fact that the plaintiffs must prove their claims beyond a reasonable doubt. My client maintains that he acted within the bounds of the law." Judge Grant's gaze didn't waver. "We'll see, Mr. Weston." As the session adjourned for the day, Carter sat at his table, his mind reeling. He had never felt so close to defeat, and the realization was both humbling and infuriating. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he could win, and the thought terrified him. The courtroom was heavy with tension as the trial approached its final stages. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and the air hummed with the collective anticipation of the spectators. The case had gripped everyone in the room, from the disillusioned plaintiffs seeking justice to the media representatives now drawn to the scandalous revelations that had emerged over the last few days. Carter Weston entered the courtroom with Theodore Banks trailing behind him, the latter's face flushed with nervous energy. Carter's usual confidence had been replaced by a taut, focused determination. The last few days had been brutal, with evidence mounting against his client and Judge Vivian Grant methodically dismantling every one of his defenses. But Carter wasn't about to go down without a fight. If this was to be his moment of reckoning, he intended to make it as difficult as possible for everyone involved. Judge Grant entered the courtroom, her presence commanding immediate silence. She took her seat at the bench, her expression calm and composed as always. Carter couldn't help but resent her poise. Over the course of this trial, she had proven herself to be an immovable force, unshaken by his usual theatrics or his attempts to control the narrative. He had thrown everything at her: objections, diversions, even personal jabs, and none of it had fazed her. Today, he would have to rely on something more than strategy. He would need sheer force of will. "Good morning," Judge Grant said, her voice steady but authoritative. "We are reconvening to address the final evidence and closing arguments in this case. Mr. Reed, you may proceed." Nathan Reed stood, his confidence now fully solidified after days of successes. He presented the final piece of evidence, a series of financial records that linked Theodore Banks to offshore accounts, where profits from the fraudulent real estate deals had been funneled. The records were meticulously detailed, showing transfers that coincided with the timeline of the fraudulent contracts. It was a damning blow, one that seemed to confirm not only the scheme, but also Banks' personal enrichment at the expense of the plaintiffs. Carter stood as soon as Reed finished. He approached the front of the courtroom, his steps deliberate, his demeanor sharp. He turned to the gallery, then to the jury, and finally to the judge. "Your Honor," he began, "while Mr. Reed has certainly painted an evocative picture, I would remind this court that correlation does not equal causation. These financial records, while suspicious, do not prove that my client orchestrated a scheme to defraud these plaintiffs. There are many plausible explanations for these transactions." Judge Grant tilted her head slightly. "And what would those explanations be, Mr. Weston?" Carter hesitated for only a moment before continuing. My client is a businessman with multiple ventures, both domestic and international. These accounts could easily be linked to unrelated projects. Without direct evidence tying these funds to the contracts in question, this remains speculation. Nathan Reed rose quickly. Your Honor, these transfers occurred within days of the plaintiffs signing their contracts. The timing is far too precise to be a coincidence. Carter turned on him, his voice rising slightly. Timing alone does not constitute proof, Mr. Reed. If we were to convict people based on circumstantial evidence alone, we would be undermining the very foundation of our justice system. The two men locked eyes for a tense moment before Judge Grant raised a hand, silencing them. Enough, she said firmly. We've heard the arguments. Mr. Reed, do you have any additional evidence to present? No, Your Honor, Reed said, his voice calm but resolute. The plaintiffs rest their case. Judge Grant nodded. Very well. Mr. Weston, you may proceed with your closing argument. Carter adjusted his tie and stepped to the center of the room. He took a moment to compose himself, scanning the faces of the jury in the gallery. This was it, his final chance to shift the tide. He cleared his throat and began. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, his voice smooth and persuasive, what we've seen over the course of this trial is an emotionally charged narrative. A group of plaintiffs, understandably upset over their circumstances, have sought to assign blame for their misfortunes. But we must remember that emotions do not equate to evidence. My client, Mr. Banks, has built his career on providing opportunities, on creating value where others see only obstacles. He has followed the law every step of the way, even if the results have not always been favorable to everyone involved. He paused, letting his words settle over the room. The evidence presented by the plaintiffs, while dramatic, does not prove intent. It does not prove malice. It does not prove that Mr. Banks acted with any criminal intent. And that is what this case hinges on, without proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The law demands that you find in favor of the defendant. Carter turned to face Judge Grant directly. Your Honor, this court is not a forum for speculation or conjecture. It is a place where the facts and the law must prevail. I trust that you will guide this jury accordingly. As he returned to his seat, Carter felt a flicker of hope. He had delivered his argument with precision and force. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that he might still have a chance. Judge Grant turned her attention to Nathan Reed. Mr. Reed, your closing argument. Reed stood and approached the jury, his demeanor calm but passionate. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury. He began. This case is not about speculation. It is not about conjecture. It is about the truth. And the truth is clear. Theodore Banks and his company exploited these plaintiffs. They manipulated contracts, falsified documents, and used every tool at their disposal to strip these families of their rights and their homes. The evidence is undeniable. He gestured to the plaintiffs, some of whom were visibly emotional. These are not just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are people whose lives have been upended by greed and dishonesty. The law exists to protect people like them, and today, you have the power to uphold that protection. I urge you to deliver the justice they deserve. When Reed finished, the courtroom was silent. Judge Grant gave her final instructions to the jury and adjourned the session, sending them off to deliberate. As the jury filed out, Carter sat motionless, his mind racing. He had done everything he could, but the outcome was now out of his hands. Hours passed as the jury deliberated. Carter and Banks remained in the courtroom, the tension between them palpable. Banks leaned over at one point, his voice a harsh whisper. If this doesn't go our way, it's on you. You promised me you could win this. Carter didn't respond. His focus was elsewhere, his thoughts spiraling as he replayed every moment of the trial in his mind. He knew the case was precarious, but he couldn't admit it. Not yet. Finally, the jury returned. The room fell silent as Judge Grant called the court to order. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked. The foreperson stood. "We have, Your Honor." Carter's heart pounded in his chest as the verdict was read. "In the matter of the People versus Western Real Estate Holdings, we find the defendant guilty on all counts." The words hit Carter like a physical blow. Beside him, Banks erupted in anger, slamming his fist on the table. Judge Grant immediately called for order, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Mr. Banks," she said sharply, "you will control yourself, or you will be removed from this courtroom." Banks glared at her but fell silent. Carter sat frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He had lost. For the first time in his career, he had faced an opponent he couldn't outmaneuver, a case he couldn't twist to his advantage. And the realization was devastating. As the courtroom emptied, Carter remained seated, staring blankly at the table in front of him. Judge Grant gathered her papers and prepared to leave, but before she did, she glanced at Carter, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Weston," she said, her voice calm but firm, "justice is not about winning or losing. It's about doing what's right. I hope you remember that." With that, she exited the room, leaving Carter to sit alone in the aftermath of his defeat. The courthouse was nearly empty when Carter Weston finally emerged from the courtroom. The crowd of plaintiffs, journalists, and onlookers had dispersed, their whispers and murmurs fading into the stillness of the early evening. He carried his briefcase in one hand, his shoulders slightly slumped, a stark contrast to the confident posture he had maintained at the start of the trial. The verdict echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. Guilty. All counts. He had lost cases before, but not like this. Never like this. As Carter made his way to the parking lot, his client, Theodore Banks, intercepted him near the courthouse steps. Banks was livid, his face red and twisted with anger. "What the hell was that, Weston?" He spat, his voice low but seething. "You told me we had this under control. You said you could win." Carter turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "I told you I'd give you the best defense possible," he replied evenly. "But I can't rewrite the facts. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury saw right through you." Banks stepped closer, his voice rising. "Don't you dare try to blame this on me. You're the lawyer. It's your job to protect me. Do you have any idea what this is going to cost me?" Carter's patience, already hanging by a thread, snapped. "It's going to cost you everything," he said coldly. "And it should. You lied to me, Banks. You didn't give me the full picture. You knew exactly what you were doing to those families, and you thought you could buy your way out of it. Well, guess what? Not even I can save you from yourself." For a moment, Banks looked stunned, as though no one had ever dared speak to him that way. Then his expression hardened, and he jabbed a finger at Carter. "You're finished, Weston. Do you hear me? Finished." Carter didn't flinch. He watched as Banks stormed off, muttering curses under his breath. The real estate mogul disappeared into a waiting car, leaving Carter standing alone on the courthouse steps. He exhaled deeply, the weight of the trial pressing down on him like a physical burden. For the first time in years, he felt utterly defeated, not just as a lawyer, but as a man. He didn't go straight home. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the city, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, regret, and self-recrimination. Every intersection, every street lamp seemed to remind him of his failures, not just in this trial, but in the choices that had brought him to this point. He thought about the families he had seen in court, their faces filled with pain and hope, and how he had dismissed them as obstacles to be overcome. He thought about Nathan Reed, the young attorney who had shown more conviction and integrity in a single trial than Carter had in years of practice. And, most of all, he thought about Judge Vivian Grant, whose unshakable resolve had exposed him for what he truly was, a man who had let his ambition consume him. Eventually, Carter found himself parked outside his office. The building was dark, its windows reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at the entrance but unable to summon the energy to go inside. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, but he ignored it. He knew it would be messages from clients, colleagues, or reporters looking for a statement. He had nothing to say. Not tonight. The next morning, Carter forced himself to return to the courthouse, not for another trial, but to meet with Judge Grant. He had requested the meeting late the previous evening, unsure if she would even agree to it. To his surprise, she had. Now, as he stood outside her chambers, he felt a nervousness he hadn't experienced in decades. The confident, arrogant facade he had so carefully cultivated was gone, leaving only the man beneath uncertain and exposed. The clerk ushered him in, and Carter stepped into the judge's chambers. The room was modest but elegant, lined with bookshelves and decorated with a few personal touches, framed photos, a potted plant, and a painting of a serene landscape. Judge Grant sat at her desk, reviewing papers. When she looked up and saw him, her expression was unreadable, though there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Mr. Weston," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Please have a seat." Carter hesitated for a moment before sitting down. He placed his briefcase on the floor, unsure of where to begin. "Thank you for agreeing to see me, Your Honor," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. Judge Grant nodded. "What can I do for you?" Carter struggled to find the right words. He had spent so many years speaking with calculated precision, twisting language to serve his purpose. Now, he found himself at a loss. "I wanted to apologize," he said at last, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "For my behavior during the trial. For my conduct in your courtroom. And frankly, for the way I've handled myself in this profession." Judge Grant leaned back slightly in her chair, studying him. "That's a rare thing to hear from someone in your position," she said after a moment. "Why now?" Carter exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because I lost," he admitted. "Not just the case. I lost something bigger. My sense of who I am, or who I thought I was. You showed me that. This trial showed me that." Judge Grant's expression softened slightly, though her tone remained measured. "And what do you plan to do with that realization, Mr. Weston?" Carter hesitated, then said, "I don't know. For so long, my only goal has been to win. To climb higher, to get bigger clients, bigger cases. But now, all I can think about are the people I've hurt along the way. The shortcuts I've taken. The corners I've cut. I don't want to be that person anymore." Judge Grant regarded him for a long moment, her gaze steady. "Acknowledging your mistakes is a start," she said finally. "But it's only a start. Change requires more than words, Mr. Weston. It requires action. If you truly want to be different, you need to show it through your choices, your work, and your commitment to doing what's right, even when it's not easy." Carter nodded slowly, her words sinking in. "You're right," he said. "I've spent my entire career avoiding accountability. It's time I started taking responsibility." Judge Grant offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Then I hope you'll follow through, because the legal profession and the world needs more people willing to stand for justice, not just personal gain." Carter stood, feeling a strange sense of relief, even in the face of her unwavering honesty. "Thank you, Your Honor. I won't forget this." As he left her chambers, Carter felt lighter somehow, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't know what the future held, But for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. Back in his office, Carter sat at his desk, staring at a blank legal pad. He had spent years filling similar pages with strategies, schemes, and plans to win at all costs. Now, he picked up his pen and began to write something different: a resignation letter to his most powerful corporate clients. It was time to walk away from the deals and cases that had defined his career. He didn't know where this new path would lead, but he knew one thing: it was a path he could finally walk with integrity. And for Carter Weston, that was the first real victory in a very long time.